The first sign was not rebellion. It was handwriting. They found it where it should not have been, on a torn scrap of ledger paper, folded small as a prayer and hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The letters were neat, careful, practiced. My name is Thomas Hale, and I was 12 years old when Virginia began asking how many slave children could read. They never asked us directly. They watched. They watched how long we stared at posted notices. They watched which children counted faster than they should. They watched who looked away first when a book was opened nearby. I learned early that silence was safer than truth. But knowledge has a way of leaving traces. In the way a boy pauses before answering, in the way his fingers move as if turning pages that are no longer there. They said no enslaved child could learn such things alone, and they were right. Someone had been teaching us, in secret, patiently, one letter at a time, and Virginia was about to make him disappear. The discovery did not arrive with shouts or chains. It came softly, the way unease often does, through patterns that refused to stay hidden. In rural Virginia in the early 1840s, plantations ran on repetition. Every task had a rhythm: planting, counting, weighing, recording. Enslaved people were expected to follow instructions, not anticipate them. Children especially were meant to obey by imitation, not by understanding. They learned where to stand, when to move, when to lower their eyes. No one expected precision from them, only compliance. That was why the first signs unsettled the white men who managed the estate. It began with numbers. An overseer noticed that sacks of tobacco counted by children always came out exact. Not close. Exact, no recounting required. When corrected, the children did not argue, but neither did they look confused. They simply nodded as if confirming something already known. At first, this was dismissed as coincidence. Some children, it was said, were simply sharp-eyed. Others were accused of mimicking older hands. The explanation rested comfortably in denial, because the alternative, education, was unthinkable. Teaching enslaved people to read and write was illegal in many places, feared as much as weapons. Knowledge suggested independence. Independence suggested rebellion. Still, the patterns continued. A clerk arrived one afternoon to inventory tools. He muttered figures aloud while marking them down, annoyed by the heat and the flies. A boy no older than 11 stood nearby, holding a bucket. When the clerk miscounted, the boy quietly shifted his weight, then spoke without raising his voice. "Beg pardon, sir. That be 13. The clerk froze. He looked at the page, counted again. The boy was right. There was no punishment at first, only silence. The boy was ordered away, but from that moment on he was watched. Not openly. Watching was done carefully. Questions were not asked directly. Instead, traps were set. Notices were nailed near the quarters. Warnings, sale lists, schedules. Written plainly, assuming the words meant nothing to those who passed them. Overseers lingered nearby, pretending to inspect fences while observing faces. Most eyes slid away, uninterested. But a few lingered a moment too long. A few mouths moved slightly, as if shaping sounds that should not exist there. Children were given errands involving numbers and marks. Fetch the crate with the chalk cross. The right crate was returned too often, too reliably. Fear crept in, slow and sour. Plantation authority depended on certainty of ignorance, certainty of dependence. The idea that children, enslaved children, might be reading in secret threatened that order. If one child knew letters, others might follow. If they could read passes, maps, laws, scripture. They could read the word freedom and understand it. So the question changed. Not are they learning, but how many? Virginia had seen this before, though never openly acknowledged it. Whispered stories traveled between plantations. A slave who could sign his name, a woman who recognized hymns by sight, a child who read aloud once before being silenced. Each case was treated as an anomaly, a problem removed before it spread. But this time felt different. Because it was not one child. It was several. Children from different quarters, different ages, no shared family line. No visible connection, except the sameness in how they behaved when confronted. They denied knowledge with identical caution. They did not stumble over lies. They did not over-explain. Their silence was practiced. That was when the planters grew truly uneasy. Meetings were held indoors away from open windows. Voices dropped when discussing the matter. No names were written. No accusations made aloud. To accuse was to admit failure, to admit that laws and fear had not been enough. Instead, they searched for the source. They questioned overseers, asking if any enslaved adult seemed above their station. They observed older men, those with quiet manners, those who kept to themselves, those who were trusted enough to move between spaces. Trust, it was realized, could be dangerous. But still, nothing was found. The brilliance of the discovery lay not in evidence, but in absence. There were no books, no slates, no chalkboards, nothing that could be confiscated. Letters left no ink trail. Numbers vanished after being spoken. Learning had been made invisible. That invisibility terrified them more than defiance ever could. For the children, the discovery was felt long before it was spoken. They sensed the shift in the air, the way footsteps paused longer near doorways, the way adults' voices tightened when giving instructions. Mothers pulled children close at night, whispering warnings not to look, not to answer, not to count out loud. Knowledge became something to hide inside the body, like breath held underwater. For Thomas and the others, this was the moment innocence ended. Before, learning had felt like a quiet gift, dangerous, yes, but warm. Now it felt like a weight. Every correct answer risked attention. Every mistake invited suspicion. The children learned a new lesson, harsher than letters, that being unseen could save your life, and being noticed, even for brilliance, could end it. The discovery did not explode. It settled. It waited. And in that waiting, Virginia began preparing to erase whatever mind had dared to teach enslaved children to think. This turning point sets the entire story in motion. Not through action, but through awareness. The moment authority realizes it is losing control is the moment fear shifts sides. And once fear belongs to power, consequences always follow. The question was not asked all at once. It was tested like the edge of a blade pressed gently against skin to see how deep it might go. In Virginia, in the year 1842, authority did not rush when it suspected danger. It waited, it observed. It allowed fear to ripen. The plantation where Thomas lived did not summon him immediately after the counting incident. That would have revealed too much concern. Instead, they changed the rules around him. Thomas was given errands that required thought, but not explanation. He was told to carry messages without being told their contents. He was asked to stand near men who spoke numbers and dates aloud. He was left alone in spaces where written marks were visible. Barn walls scratched with old tallies, crates marked with letters, meant only for sorting. Each task was ordinary. Each was a test. Thomas understood this without being told. He had learned early that knowledge must never appear eager. The man who taught him had said this more than once, not as a warning but as instruction. Never be the first to answer. Never show your hand. Intelligence, the man explained, was not proven by speed but by restraint. So Thomas slowed himself. He counted twice before speaking, then sometimes said nothing at all. He pretended confusion when a simpler answer would have been safer. He made mistakes on purpose, small ones, the kind that looked natural. Still, something betrayed him. It was not his words. It was his eyes. When a clerk dropped a folded paper near the smokehouse, Thomas glanced down without thinking. The glance lasted no more than a heartbeat. But in that heartbeat, his gaze moved in a way that could not be taught without letters. It moved left to right. That was enough. The following morning, Thomas was taken from the quarters earlier than usual. Not dragged. Not struck. He was told calmly to follow. Calmness, he would later understand, was the most dangerous tone of all. He was brought to a small room attached to the main house. A room that smelled of ink and old wood. A single window let in narrow light. On the table lay a ledger open. Thomas stood where he was told. His hands were empty. That mattered. The man behind the table did not look angry. He looked curious. "How old are you, boy?" the man asked. 12, sir." "And your work?" "I carry. I fetch. I clean." The man nodded, as if checking items off an invisible list. Then he turned the ledger slightly. Not toward Thomas, but not away either. "What do these marks mean?" he asked, tapping the page lightly. Thomas felt his chest tighten. This was the moment his teacher had warned him about. Not punishment. Not shouting. The invitation. "I don't know, sir," Thomas said. His voice did not shake. That was the problem. The man waited. Silence filled the room, heavy and deliberate. Silence was meant to draw things out of people, the way heat draws sweat. Thomas counted his breaths. He remembered the rules: deny simply, do not elaborate, do not look at the page again. The man closed the ledger. "Can you count?" "Yes, sir." "To what number?" "As far as I'm told." That answer earned the faintest smile. A second man entered the room then, carrying a crate marked with chalk symbols. He placed it on the floor and stepped back. "Which crate belongs in the east storehouse?" the first man asked casually. Thomas looked at the marks. He knew them. They were letters pretending to be symbols. He could read them as clearly as his own name. But he did not answer right away. He stepped forward, lifted one crate, then hesitated, long enough to appear unsure. He chose the correct one anyway. The man behind the table said nothing. That was worse than rebuke. Over the next several days, Thomas was questioned again and again, always differently. Sometimes alone, sometimes in the presence of others. He was asked to identify tools, to repeat spoken instructions, to follow sequences given only once. He was never asked directly if he could read or write. That question would have forced a denial or a confession. Instead, they sought confirmation through behavior. What troubled them was not that Thomas answered correctly. It was how he answered. He paused before responding, as if weighing meaning. He corrected himself mid-sentence, not in panic but in precision. He used words carefully, never too many, never too few. These were habits of study, not accident. They began asking about others. "Who do you spend time with? Who speaks to you at night? Who taught you your numbers?" Thomas answered truthfully where truth was harmless. He named no one unnecessarily. He said he listened. He watched. He learned by doing. That was partly true, but it was not enough. The conclusion formed quietly among the men. This child knew more than he should. And children did not teach themselves in such a manner. Someone had invested time. Someone had been patient. And patience was not a child's trait. The danger of Thomas was not rebellion. He had shown none. He obeyed orders. He worked well. He caused no trouble. That was precisely why he frightened them. A rebellious child could be punished. A clever one could not be unmade. By the end of the week, Thomas was returned to his usual work. No announcement was made. No punishment delivered. To the quarters, it appeared nothing had changed. But Thomas knew better. He had been weighed, not in strength, but in mind. And once weighed, one is never forgotten. From that moment on, he understood the truth his teacher had never spoken aloud. That knowledge, once seen, cannot be unseen, and even silence leaves an echo. No one saw the teacher arrive, and no one could remember when he had begun. That, perhaps, was his greatest protection. In Virginia in the year 1842, men like him were meant to blend into the background of labor, to be counted, owned, moved, but never examined closely. He was older than most, his hair already threaded with gray, his back slightly bent not from weakness, but from habit. He spoke little. When spoken to, he answered plainly. He was known for patience, not cleverness. That reputation had been built carefully over many years. Among the enslaved, he was called Elias, though no one knew if that was the name he had been given or the one he had chosen to keep. Names mattered less than survival. Elias understood this well. He worked wherever he was placed. Sometimes in the carpenter's shed, sometimes mending harnesses, sometimes hauling water. His value lay in his reliability. He did not draw attention. He did not argue. He did not rush. Overseers trusted men like Elias because they mistook quiet endurance for ignorance. They were wrong. Elias had learned his letters long before Thomas was born. How he learned them was never spoken aloud. Some guessed a former owner had used him as a house servant. Others whispered that a traveling preacher once taught him scripture. The truth, whatever it was, had been buried alongside other dangerous memories. What mattered was not the origin of his knowledge, but what he chose to do with it. He did not begin by teaching. That would have been reckless. Instead, he began by watching. He watched which children listened more than they spoke, which ones lingered near posted notices without staring, which ones asked questions that were almost questions, careful not to sound curious. He watched how they counted, how they remembered, how they noticed patterns in daily work. Patience was the first lesson, though the children did not know they were being taught. When Elias finally began, it was not with letters. It was with order. He taught them to recognize sequences, how days followed one another, how work repeated in cycles, how spoken instructions held structure. He taught them to listen for beginnings and endings, to remember the middle. Only when a child could hold a sequence without faltering did he move on. Letters were introduced without being named. An A was a shape drawn in ash on the ground, smudged away before dawn. A, B was a sound paired with a tool mark. Words were never written whole at first. That would have been too tempting, too dangerous. Everything Elias taught could be explained away as coincidence. If questioned, a child could truthfully say he had never seen a book. Lessons took place at night, but not every night. Regularity invited suspicion. Elias knew this. He taught in fragments, 10 minutes here, 5 minutes there. A lesson might be split across weeks. He understood that knowledge grew stronger when it was forced to wait. There were no punishments for mistakes. That, too, was deliberate. Fear already ruled their lives. Learning needed a different air to breathe. When a child erred, Elias corrected gently or not at all, letting understanding arrive on its own. He believed that the mind, once opened, would search for its own answers. He never raised his voice. That alone set him apart. For Thomas, Elias was not a figure of authority, but of steadiness. He did not promise escape. He did not speak of freedom as a destination. He spoke of seeing clearly, of knowing what was being said, even when words were meant to deceive. Listen twice, Elias once murmured while repairing a chair leg. Once for what they say, once for what they don't. That lesson stayed with Thomas longer than any letter. Elias taught reading the way others taught breathing, quietly, without drama. Writing was introduced last and sparingly. There was no paper to waste. Instead, children traced letters in dirt, on wood, on the inside of their palms. Writing was something to feel, not display. Above all, Elias taught restraint. Knowing is not the same as showing, he told them. A sharp blade stays sheathed. This philosophy shaped every student. It was why, when suspicion arose, none of the children panicked. Panic betrayed knowledge. Calmness concealed it. For months, perhaps years, the system worked. Then Thomas was questioned. When word reached Elias that Thomas had been taken aside by the white men, he did not react outwardly. He continued his work. He finished repairing a broken handle. He nodded when spoken to. But that night there was no lesson, nor the night after. Elias understood the meaning of the pause. Discovery did not always come with accusations. Sometimes it came with attention. And attention was fatal. He began to withdraw, not abruptly, but gradually. He stopped positioning himself near the children. He avoided eye contact. He spoke less, if that were possible. He became exactly what the overseers expected, an aging man nearing usefulness's end. This withdrawal was its own lesson, though unspoken. The children learned that survival sometimes meant separation, that protecting knowledge might require abandoning its transmission. Elias knew that continuing would risk not just himself, but every child he had taught, and so he prepared for disappearance, not escape, not rebellion, erasure. He destroyed what little evidence existed. Ash drawings were scattered, marks were rubbed smooth. He altered routines so nothing appeared missing. The children were told nothing directly. Instructions would have lingered too clearly. When Elias was finally removed, sent away to another plantation, sold quietly, or assigned elsewhere, no announcement followed. No explanation was offered. He simply stopped being there. To the overseers, his absence was confirmation. To the children, it was loss. Yet what authority never understood was this: the true danger was not Elias himself. It was what he had already done. He had taught children how to think slowly, how to observe without reacting, how to carry knowledge inward, where it could not be confiscated. Elias vanished, but his lessons did not. Knowledge did not leave with Elias. It stayed behind, lodged in the minds of children who now understood something dangerous, that what they carried inside them could be taken away or used against them. After Elias disappeared, the plantation did not return to normal. It only pretended to. The adults sensed it first. Mothers noticed how their children stopped asking questions they once whispered at night. Fathers noticed how sons who had learned to observe now learned to look away. Knowledge, once shared, had become a private burden. And burdens, when carried in silence, grow heavier. Virginia in the 1840s did not need to announce its cruelty. It relied on atmosphere, on implication, on the quiet tightening of rules that were never written down. Children were separated more often. Groups that once worked together were divided. Younger ones were moved closer to overseers' paths. Night movement was discouraged, not through whips, but through presence. Lanterns appeared where darkness had once offered cover. Footsteps lingered longer outside cabins. No one said, "We know what you were taught." They said, "Be careful." That was enough. For Thomas, the cost of knowing arrived slowly, like hunger. He found himself weighing every thought before allowing it to surface. Counting became dangerous. Reading, once a private miracle, became a threat. When notices were posted, he trained his eyes to blur the words deliberately, to see shapes instead of meaning. This effort took more strength than ignorance ever had. At night, when the quarters settled into uneasy sleep, Thomas replayed Elias's lessons in his mind, afraid they might fade if not remembered, but equally afraid of holding them too tightly. Knowledge now existed in a narrow space between survival and self-erasure. Other children struggled differently. One girl, barely 10, stopped speaking altogether except when spoken to. Her silence was praised. Praise, Thomas noticed, always carried a warning beneath it. Another boy began making mistakes on purpose, dropping tools, miscounting steps, until the overseer laughed and dismissed him as slow. Slowness, it turned out, was protection. But protection came at a price. The children learned to dull themselves outwardly. Over time, the dullness threatened to move inward. The adults could not shield them completely. Some tried. Mothers warned their children not to remember too much, not to dream aloud. Knowing don't feed you. One woman whispered to her son, "It just makes them watch you closer." These warnings were not born of ignorance. They were born of experience. Punishments increased, but never openly tied to learning. A child was reassigned for attitude. Another was separated for being restless. These words floated without explanation, but everyone understood what they meant. The cost of knowing was never paid all at once. It was paid in choices. Do you answer correctly or survive? Do you remember or forget to stay alive? Do you honor the man who taught you or protect yourself by pretending he never existed? Thomas began to understand that knowledge was not freedom. It was responsibility. One evening, he overheard an overseer speaking to another near the barn. Their voices were low, casual. "Smart ones don't stay smart long," one said. "No," the other replied. "They either learn their place or someone teaches it to them." Thomas stood frozen in the shadows, the weight of those words pressing into him. He realized then that Elias had not only taught them letters, he had taught them the danger of being seen. This realization marked a shift in Thomas's mind. Until now, learning had felt like accumulation. Now it became filtration. He began deciding which thoughts to keep active and which to bury deep. Some lessons he practiced silently, replaying them in his head like hymns no one else could hear. Others he allowed to grow faint, trusting they might return later, when it was safer. This internal division was exhausting. Children were not meant to live with such calculations. Yet Thomas and the others did, because the alternative was worse. What authority never fully grasped was that fear did not erase knowledge, it reshaped it. Learning adapted, it went inward. It hid behind obedience. It learned to wait. The plantation believed it had succeeded. No more children answered too quickly. No more glances lingered on posted notices. The quarters grew quieter, more compliant. From the outside, order had been restored. But beneath that order, something had hardened. The children who had learned in secret now understood power in a way they never had before. They saw how quickly intelligence became threat, how silence could be armor, how survival required performance. They learned to read people as carefully as words. This too was knowledge, and it could not be outlawed. Key turning point no. 4 is where the story darkens inwardly. There is no dramatic punishment, no public reckoning. Instead, the cruelty of the system reveals itself through consequence and atmosphere. The cost of knowing is not immediate death or pain. It is the forced narrowing of the self. Yet within that narrowing lies resilience, because even as the children dim themselves outwardly, something endures beneath the surface. Memory does not vanish. It waits. Knowledge becomes quieter, sharper, more patient. And patience, Elias taught them, was the longest form of resistance. Time did what force could not. It moved on. Seasons passed over the Virginia plantation as they always had. Tobacco planted, cured, packed, sold. Children grew taller. Some were moved away. Others were given new tasks. New names were spoken more often than old ones. Elias's absence faded into the ordinary silence of loss that marked enslaved life. And yet, what he had given did not vanish. It changed form. Thomas learned this slowly, not through instruction, but through noticing. He noticed how the children who had learned in secret grew careful rather than broken. They spoke less but listened more. They followed orders, but remembered alternatives. They carried themselves with a restraint that did not belong to fear alone. Knowledge, once exposed, had retreated inward. Thomas himself changed. He no longer rehearsed letters nightly, afraid repetition might sharpen longing into recklessness. Instead, he let memory surface only when needed. A posted notice might mean nothing at a glance, but its message would settle into his mind without effort. Spoken instructions revealed more than the speaker intended. Numbers formed patterns. Patterns formed understanding. He did not share this. Sharing had ended with Elias. The plantation believed the matter resolved. Overseers reported no further incidents. Children appeared duller, slower, properly dependent. That was what authority required. Not obedience alone, but the appearance of emptiness behind the eyes. Yet some habits could not be unlearned. Thomas still paused before speaking, not out of fear, but precision. He weighed words instinctively. He noticed contradictions in orders and complied in ways that avoided consequence. When punished unjustly, he did not protest. Protest was loud. Endurance was quiet. Other children carried the legacy differently. One girl learned to remember stories exactly as told, storing them like pages in her mind. Another boy grew adept at routes and distances, able to recall paths after walking them once. None of this could be outlawed. None of it required ink or paper. Years later, when Thomas was nearly grown, a new clerk arrived. Young, careless, eager to impress. He left papers unattended. He spoke too freely. He assumed ignorance where silence stood. Thomas never corrected him. But he listened. That listening, so carefully cultivated, allowed Thomas to understand more about the world beyond the plantation than many white men realized. He learned dates, names, destinations. He learned that knowledge did not need to be displayed to be powerful. It only needed to be retained. Elias's greatest lesson revealed itself then, that survival was not merely enduring the present, but preparing quietly for futures that could not yet be spoken. The children who had been taught in secret grew into adults who did not announce what they knew. They carried memory like an heirloom, hidden, protected, passed only when safety allowed. Some would never pass it on at all. Silence, too, was a form of guardianship. When older enslaved men spoke of the past, Thomas listened differently. He heard patterns where others heard complaint. He learned which words were warnings disguised as stories. He learned how history survived not through records, but through recall. Years blurred. The plantation changed hands. Rules shifted. New fears replaced old ones. Elias's name was spoken less often, until it was spoken only inside Thomas's thoughts, where it remained intact. Thomas sometimes wondered what had become of him, whether Elias had survived elsewhere, whether he had taught again, or whether he had chosen silence forever. There were no answers. And yet, Elias endured, not as a presence, but as a method. The children he taught had learned how to carry knowledge without being consumed by it, how to live with understanding without allowing it to expose them. They had learned that memory could be both refuge and risk. On certain nights, Thomas lay awake, listening to the breath of the quarters, to the wind pressing against wood. He replayed the lessons not as letters, but as feelings. The patience in Elias's voice, the calm insistence that learning was not haste, but endurance. He realized then that the true legacy was not literacy alone. It was composure. It was the refusal to let cruelty dictate the shape of the inner self. Years later still, when Thomas was no longer counted among the children, he encountered a boy who watched too carefully. The boy said nothing unusual, asked no forbidden questions, but his eyes followed movement with intent. Thomas recognized himself. He did not teach the boy letters. He did not risk that. Instead, he said quietly, while passing a tool from one hand to another, "Listen more than you speak. Remember what you seek, and keep what you know close." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but feeling the weight of the words. That was how the legacy survived. Not in books, not in records, but in the careful shaping of minds taught to endure. Virginia never found proof of what had happened. The authorities recorded no crime, no rebellion, no evidence worth preserving. To history, the moment passed unnoticed, but memory does not require permission. It lives where silence protects it. It waits where voices cannot. And long after Elias vanished, long after suspicion faded, the knowledge he planted remained, quiet, intact, and patient enough to survive a world determined to deny it.